Welcome to Horror Echo. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from and the time. Now, relax and join me on a journey into the unknown. Story number 1, The Shadow in the Mirror. It was the kind of night when the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving everything wrapped in darkness. Kelly had just moved into an old apartment on the edge of town. It was small, a bit rundown, but cheap. She had always wanted a place of her own, and now, here she was. But there was something strange about this apartment. Something she couldn't quite put her finger on. At first, she noticed small things, doors creaking open when no one was around, strange whispers echoing from the walls at night. But Kelly tried to brush it off as the quirks of an old building. Then, one evening, as she was unpacking a box in the living room, she saw it. She passed by the hallway mirror, a large, antique piece that had come with the apartment, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing behind her. The reflection was blurry, like someone in a fog, but Kelly was alone. She spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. She laughed nervously, telling herself it was just her imagination. But the feeling lingered. That night, as Kelly settled into bed, the apartment seemed colder than usual. She pulled the covers tightly around her and closed her eyes, hoping for sleep. But a chill ran up her spine as she suddenly felt a presence, something heavy and watchful. She opened her eyes to see the reflection of herself in the mirror across from her bed. Only, this time, there was something different. In the mirror, standing just behind her, was the shadow of a tall figure, cloaked in darkness. Its eyes were glowing and unnatural, pale blue. Kelly froze, unable to move. She stared at the shadow in the mirror, her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move, but it felt like it was staring straight into her soul. She tried to look away, but her eyes refused to leave the mirror. The shadow's gaze was intense, piercing. She finally mustered the courage to turn around, her heart pounding in her chest. But when she looked, there was no one there, just the emptiness of the room. She turned back to the mirror, her pulse racing. The figure was gone. Kelly didn't sleep that night. In the following days, the shadow appeared more frequently. It wasn't always in the mirror, but she could feel it lurking in the corners of her vision, just out of reach. Sometimes, it would tap on the window or stand at the end of her bed, watching her. It never made a sound, but she could feel its presence, always waiting. She called the landlord, asking if anyone else had reported strange occurrences, but the landlord only laughed it off. "It's an old building," he said. "Sometimes the light plays tricks." But Kelly knew the truth. One night, desperate for answers, Kelly stood in front of the mirror again. She stared into her reflection, trying to gather the courage to speak. "Who are you?" she whispered. There was a long silence. Then, in the coldest voice she had ever heard, the shadow responded, "I was here first." Suddenly, the air grew thick with dread, and Kelly felt her legs give way beneath her. She stumbled backward, crashing to the floor. The mirror cracked as the shadow lunged toward her, its cold, ghostly fingers grazing her arm. She scrambled to her feet, bolting from the apartment and never looking back. Kelly never returned to that apartment. The building was abandoned shortly after, and rumors spread about strange happenings inside. The mirror, however, was never removed. Some say it still stands, waiting for the next person to move in. And perhaps, just perhaps, the shadow still lingers, waiting for someone else to stare into its eyes. Story number 2, The Woman in the Window. Samantha had always been skeptical about ghost stories. Growing up, She'd laugh at her friends' tales of haunted houses and mysterious figures, brushing them off as overactive imaginations. But that all changed when she moved to a small town in rural New England. It was the perfect place to escape the hustle and bustle of city life, or so she thought. The house she rented was an old, Victorian-style building with creaky floors and a large, looming front porch. It had a certain charm to it, almost as if it had been frozen in time. Samantha loved the place, but she couldn't shake the strange feeling that clung to it. It was as though the house was holding onto something, some presence, some history, that she couldn't quite understand. On the first night, she settled in and opened the curtains of her bedroom window, admiring the view of the quiet street. The moonlight bathed the scene in a soft glow, casting long shadows across the front lawn. It was peaceful. But as Samantha was about to close the curtains, she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. At the far end of the street, there was a woman standing in front of a house. She was pale, dressed in an old-fashioned white dress that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. Her face was hidden in shadow, but Samantha could see her standing still, staring at the house. She shrugged it off, figuring it was just a neighbor or someone out for a late-night stroll. But something about the woman's stillness unnerved her. She felt a strange, inexplicable pull to the window, like she couldn't look away. The next morning, Samantha tried to forget the strange encounter, but the woman stayed in her mind. As the days passed, she noticed that the woman seemed to be in the same spot each evening, always standing in front of the same house, her gaze fixed on Samantha's window. It wasn't until a week later that Samantha finally decided to confront the mystery. That night, she waited until the woman appeared again. Sure enough, as the clock struck midnight, there she was, standing still in the same place. This time, Samantha was determined to figure out what was going on. She grabbed her coat and walked out the front door, making her way down the street toward the woman. The closer she got, the colder the air became. It was as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the woman, who remained motionless, staring at the house across from her. "Excuse me," Samantha called out, her voice shaking. "Are you okay?" The woman didn't respond. Samantha took another step forward, now just a few feet away. She could see the woman's face more clearly now, though it was still shrouded in darkness. Her features were pale, almost ghostly, and her hair hung in long, tangled strands around her face. There was something eerily familiar about her, something that made Samantha's blood run cold. "Hello?" Samantha tried again, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's head slowly turned toward Samantha, and for the first time, Samantha saw her eyes. They were wide open, empty, with no pupils, just pools of blackness. Samantha froze, her body refusing to move. The woman's lips parted, and in a voice that sent a chill through Samantha's bones, she whispered, "She'll be waiting for you." Before Samantha could respond, the woman's figure seemed to dissolve into the air, as if she had never been there at all. The street was empty once again, and the coldness lifted as quickly as it had come. Shaken to her core, Samantha rushed back to her house. She slammed the door behind her and locked it, her mind racing with questions. Who was that woman? And what did she mean by "she'll be waiting for you"? The next morning, Samantha decided to do some research on the house she was renting. To her horror, she discovered that years ago, a woman had died in the very spot she had seen the figure standing. She was the widow of the original owner of the house, and after her husband's death, she had spent every night waiting at the window, staring out into the street. It was said that she died in the house under mysterious circumstances, her death ruled as a suicide. But local legend had always whispered that she was still waiting,
waiting for someone to join her. Samantha moved out of the house the next week. She couldn't shake the feeling that the woman's warning had been a prophecy, that one day, someone else would be waiting for her. No matter where she went, the image of the woman's empty eyes haunted her, following her wherever she went. The house remained empty for months after Samantha left, but the neighbors say that on some nights, when the moon is full, you can still see a figure standing at the window, waiting. Story number 3. The phone call from the past. It was late at night when Alex's phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the silence of his apartment. Groggy and irritated, he fumbled for his phone, expecting it to be some spam call or a wrong number. But when he saw the name on the screen, his heart skipped a beat. It was his grandmother's number. Now, Alex loved his grandmother dearly, but she had passed away 2 years ago. She had been a constant figure in his life, always there with a warm hug, an old story, or a homemade cookie. Her death had hit him hard, and ever since, he had done his best to keep her memory alive. He hesitated, staring at the screen as the phone continued to ring. The call wasn't coming from her phone, though. It was coming from her old landline. Alex had kept the number active, mostly as a sentimental gesture, but he never expected to get a call from it. With a mix of confusion and dread, he answered the call. Hello? There was a long pause, the kind that felt far too heavy for something so simple. Then, a soft, familiar voice broke the silence. Alex, is that you? His breath caught in his throat. It was his grandmother's voice, unmistakable despite the years that had passed since her last words. Her voice was warm, just like he remembered, but there was something strange about it, something distant, as if it was coming from the other side of a thick fog. Grandma, he whispered, his voice shaking. Is that really you? There was a soft chuckle on the other end, but it didn't sound quite right. It was slower, more deliberate. I've missed you, dear. I have something to tell you. Alex's mind raced. Was this some kind of sick prank? Maybe someone had somehow gotten access to her old number and was messing with him. But the voice was so real, so familiar. He tried to steady his breathing. Grandma, how is this even possible? You're gone. The voice on the other end sighed, a long, drawn-out breath that sounded far too deep for the elderly woman he had known. I know, Alex. I know. But I've been trying to reach you, trying to warn you. Warn me? What do you mean? There was a long silence, and Alex felt a chill creep down his spine as the voice on the other end seemed to grow fainter. You need to listen carefully, the voice continued, now quieter and more urgent. Don't go to the house. Not tonight. There's something waiting for you there. Something old. It's not safe. Alex's mind swirled with confusion. What was his grandmother talking about? He hadn't been to the old family house in years, not since her funeral. It was a place filled with memories, some good, some bad. Why would he go back now? Before he could speak, the line went silent. Alex pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at it in disbelief. Was it over? He didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was his mind playing tricks on him, or maybe it was just a very elaborate prank. But that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He couldn't ignore the warning in his grandmother's voice. He couldn't explain why, but something deep inside him urged him to listen. After hours of pacing around his apartment, he finally gave in. He drove to the house, the place he hadn't set foot in since his grandmother's passing. The old house stood dark and silent, like it always had. The windows were covered in dust, the lawn overgrown with weeds. Everything felt still. He walked up to the front door and paused. A strange unease washed over him. He wasn't sure why, but he could hear his grandmother's voice echoing in his mind. Don't go to the house. Not tonight. But it was too late to turn back now. He pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest. The air inside was thick with the smell of age and decay, as if the house had been left untouched for years. He stepped cautiously inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Suddenly, the lights flickered on, and Alex froze. The room was filled with shadows, and in the center of it all, he saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the middle of the living room. It was a man, tall, dressed in old clothes that looked like they belonged to another time. His face was obscured by shadows, but Alex could feel his eyes, cold, piercing, staring at him from the darkness. "Who are you?" Alex demanded, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figure didn't move. But Alex felt a heavy presence, like something was pressing down on him from all sides. Then, he heard the faintest whisper, as if the wind itself was carrying a voice from the past. "She never left." The words sent a shiver through his entire body. He backed away slowly, heart pounding in his chest. He didn't understand what was happening. What did the figure mean by that? And why had his grandmother warned him? Without thinking, he turned and bolted out of the house, slamming the door behind him. As he got into his car and sped away, he looked back at the house. For a brief moment, he swore he saw his grandmother's face in one of the windows, smiling faintly. Alex never returned to the house. He couldn't bring himself to face whatever was waiting for him there. The phone call had been the last connection he had with his grandmother. And as for the figure in the house, he would never know who or what it truly was. But he would never forget the warning. She never left. Story number 4, The Whispering Woods. Lena had always loved the woods behind her family's cabin. Growing up, it was a place of adventure, a place where she would explore with her friends, climb trees, and play hide and seek among the towering pines. There was an eerie beauty to the forest, with its twisting paths and deep, dense foliage. But when she was older, something changed. Lena hadn't been to the cabin in years. She was living in the city now, with a busy job and a busy life, but something pulled her back one autumn weekend. She needed a break. She missed the peace and quiet of the forest, the smell of pine needles and fresh earth, and the calm that the woods had always provided. When she arrived, the cabin was just as she remembered it, weathered, a little worn down, but still standing strong. The woods were still there too, stretching out beyond the back porch like a living, breathing thing. That evening, after dinner, Lena decided to take a walk. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp soil. She stepped onto the familiar dirt path leading into the woods, the ground soft beneath her boots. The trees stretched high above, their branches creaking in the wind. As she walked deeper into the woods, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. It was the same feeling she'd had as a child when she would wander too far from the cabin. She had always chalked it up to an overactive imagination back then, but now, the feeling was stronger, more real. The woods felt different. There was a stillness to the air that seemed unnatural. She stopped, listening. It was quiet, too quiet. Then, she heard it. A whisper. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it was there. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, as if carried on the wind, or maybe just in her mind. Lena stood still, straining to hear it again. "Come closer," the voice seemed to say, so faint she wasn't sure if it was real. Lena frowned. Her heart began to race. It couldn't be. She was alone. She took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease. She had been coming to these woods since she was a child. There was nothing here, nothing to be afraid of. But as she continued on, the whisper came again, louder this time, and clearer. "Come closer, come play with me." Her skin prickled. That wasn't the voice of the wind or her imagination. It was something else, something darker. Her legs felt heavy, as if the earth itself was trying to hold her in place. But curiosity, and maybe something else, something she couldn't explain, compelled her to keep walking. She followed the whisper, deeper into the woods. The trees around her seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer, darker, and the air colder. The wind had died completely, leaving only the sound of her footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves beneath her feet. And then she saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the tree line. It was small, hunched over, and cloaked in darkness. Lena couldn't make out its features, but she could feel its presence, its cold, unnatural energy. Her breath caught in her throat. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving, watching her. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it was all around her, echoing from every direction. It wasn't just one voice now. It was dozens, all speaking at once, overlapping, calling out in an eerie chorus. "Come, come play, stay with us." Lena took a step back, heart hammering in her chest. The figure seemed to glide closer, moving with an unnatural smoothness, its eyes, if it even had eyes, piercing her soul. A cold wave of dread washed over her, and she knew she needed to leave. She turned to run, but found herself frozen in place. The whispering intensified, a crescendo of voices that twisted in her mind, drowning out all rational thought. "You can't leave. You have to stay. You're one of us now." With all the strength she could muster, Lena broke free from the invisible hold. She turned and ran, her breath ragged, her heart pounding in her ears. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, the path twisting and turning as though trying to confuse her, to trap her. But somehow, through sheer will, she found her way back to the cabin. She burst through the door, slamming it behind her, locking it tightly. The whispering faded, but the feeling of being watched never left her. Lena sat in silence, shaking, trying to understand what had just happened. What was that thing in the woods? And why had it called to her? She never went back into the woods again. The following year, she heard about a couple who had recently moved to the area. They decided to go hiking in the woods near the cabin. They never returned. Search parties were sent out, but they found nothing. No signs of struggle, no traces of the couple at all, just an empty trail and the eerie silence of the woods. Lena still wonders, to this day, if the whispering voices in the woods are still waiting for someone else to come closer. And if she had stayed, just a little longer, would she have become one of them? Story number 5, The Watcher in the Attic. It was late autumn when Jake and his girlfriend Emily decided to move into their first house together. The house was charming, located on a quiet street just outside of town. It had a rustic feel, with wooden floors, old-fashioned furniture, and a large attic that seemed to hold secrets. Emily, a lover of old houses, was thrilled. Jake, on the other hand, was more skeptical. He found the house a bit too quiet for his liking, but he pushed the feeling aside. From the moment they moved in, strange things started happening. It wasn't anything overt, no doors slamming or objects flying across the room, but small, unnerving things that Jake couldn't explain. The lights would flicker in certain rooms, the air would grow inexplicably cold, and sometimes, when he was alone, he could hear faint noises, scratching, dragging sounds, coming from above, from the attic. Jake tried to ignore it. He thought it was just the house settling, the creaking of old wood and pipes. But Emily began to notice it too. It started when they were cleaning up the attic one day, sorting through boxes and old furniture. There was a large, ornate mirror in the corner, its frame covered in dust. As Emily wiped it down, she turned to Jake and said, "Do you ever feel like we're being watched?" Jake laughed it off. "It's just the house. Old houses can make you feel like that." But Emily wasn't convinced. She said she felt like there was something in the attic, something that wasn't quite right. Jake tried to ease her mind, but that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. It started that evening. They were sitting in the living room, watching a movie, when the noises began. Faint scraping sounds, like something was being dragged across the floor above them. Jake tensed, his eyes darting toward the ceiling. Emily looked at him, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Jake nodded, his heart pounding. He stood up, motioning for Emily to stay put. He went into the hallway, then climbed the stairs to the attic door. It was locked, something they hadn't noticed before. It was strange because the door had never been locked when they moved in. He stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the cold doorknob. The scratching sound grew louder. "Who's up there?" Jake called out. No response. He quickly grabbed a key from the kitchen drawer and unlocked the door. The attic stairs creaked as he ascended, each step echoing through the empty house. The light above flickered, casting long shadows across the room. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and dusty sheets, but it felt different now. The air was heavier, colder. Then, his eyes fell upon it. There, in the far corner, a figure stood motionless, its back turned toward him. It was tall, thin, with long, messy hair that fell in front of its face. Jake's heart stopped. He could barely breathe. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It was just standing there, as if it had been waiting for him to find it. "Emily?" Jake called shakily, his voice barely a whisper. But the figure didn't respond. Slowly, as if in a trance, Jake moved closer. The figure turned its head slightly, revealing a face so pale and gaunt it seemed unnatural, its eyes wide open, empty, and cold. It smiled. No, it grinned, and Jake froze in terror. Before he could react, the figure stepped backward into the shadows, disappearing into the dark corners of the attic. Jake rushed forward, his hand trembling as he flicked the light switch, but the figure was gone. The attic was empty. Shaking, Jake descended the stairs, his mind racing. Emily was waiting for him in the living room, her face pale with fear. "What happened?" she asked, her voice quivering. Jake didn't know how to explain it, but he knew one thing for certain: something was wrong with that attic. That night, he locked the door to the attic and placed a heavy dresser in front of it, convinced that whatever had been up there, whatever had been watching them, could never come back. But the next morning, things took a darker turn. The dresser had been moved. It wasn't just pushed a little to the side. It was as if someone had dragged it across the floor, leaving deep scratches in the wood. That was the last straw for Jake. They packed up their things and left the house that same day. As they drove away, looking back at the old house, Jake saw something in the attic window, a shadow. It was watching them, just as it had been all along. To this day, the house remains vacant, and no one dares to move in. Neighbors have said they occasionally see lights flickering in the attic at night, and sometimes, they swear they can hear faint whispers carried on the wind. But no one ever goes near that house again, no one except the thing that watches from the attic. Story number 6, The Lost Child. It was a typical fall evening when Sarah, a young woman in her early 20s, decided to take a walk through the park near her apartment. The weather was crisp, with a soft breeze rustling the fallen leaves along the ground. The park was quiet. Most people had already gone home to enjoy their warm dinners or settle in for the night. Sarah loved the park at this time of day. It felt peaceful, almost magical, with the trees casting long, eerie shadows under the dimming sky. She walked the familiar path around the edge of the park, admiring the colors of the autumn leaves. But something unusual caught her attention that evening. A small figure, no more than 6 or 7 years old, stood at the far end of the park near the woods. At first, Sarah thought it was a child playing, perhaps waiting for a parent or guardian. But as she got closer, she felt a strange chill in the air. The child stood completely still, staring at her with wide, vacant eyes. It was a boy, dressed in a dirty, old-fashioned coat, his hair dark and unkempt. Sarah slowed her pace, her curiosity piqued. "Hey there," she called out gently, hoping to see a parent nearby. But the child didn't move. He just stood there, staring at her with that unsettling, emotionless gaze. "Are you lost?" Sarah asked, walking closer. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he turned and started walking toward the woods, his small feet barely making a sound on the dirt path. Sarah hesitated. There was something wrong about the way he moved, so deliberate, as if he wasn't afraid of the dark woods at all. Her instincts told her to stay away, but the image of the lonely child nagged at her. Without thinking, Sarah followed him. She walked deeper into the park, the trees around her growing denser, blocking out what little light was left. The boy continued walking, his small figure getting farther and farther away. He never looked back. "Hey, wait up!" Sarah called, her voice echoing through the woods. But the boy didn't respond. Finally, Sarah caught up to him, standing just a few feet behind him. She reached out a hand. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice full of concern. The boy turned to face her, and Sarah recoiled in horror. His face was pale, almost gray, with dark circles under his eyes. His skin was cold, unnaturally cold. But what terrified Sarah the most was the emptiness in his eyes. There was no sign of life there, only a hollow, lifeless stare. His lips curled into a twisted, empty smile, and he whispered something that sent a shiver down her spine. "They're waiting for you." Suddenly, a gust of wind rushed through the trees, knocking the leaves into the air. Sarah looked around in panic, but when she turned back to the boy, he was gone. Just vanished into thin air. Panic surged through her body. She had to get out of there. She ran back toward the park's exit, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she passed through the trees, something stopped her in her tracks. There, standing just beyond the edge of the woods, was the boy again, watching her from a distance. This time, his face was obscured by shadow, but Sarah could still feel his presence, lurking in the darkness. She stood frozen, unable to move, as the boy's voice echoed once more, "They're waiting for you." Without another thought, Sarah turned and sprinted the rest of the way out of the park. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she finally reached the safety of her apartment. She slammed the door behind her and locked it, her hands shaking uncontrollably. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still see the boy's pale face, his hollow eyes, and hear his whisper in the dark. She tried to tell herself it was just a strange encounter, perhaps a trick of the light or her imagination, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. The next day, Sarah returned to the park, hoping to find some explanation for the strange event. She searched the area near the woods, but there was no sign of the boy. No trace of his footsteps, no evidence he had ever been there at all. She asked around, but no one had seen him. A week later, Sarah's unease grew when she learned something chilling from a local newspaper. There had been a case of a missing child in the town years ago, a little boy who had disappeared without a trace while playing in that very park. No one had ever found him. The article said that the boy had been last seen near the woods, around the time of Sarah's encounter. Sarah's heart sank as she realized the truth. The boy wasn't just lost, he was something else. Something that had never left the park, waiting for someone to join him. And now, every time she passed that park, she could feel his presence, watching her from the shadows. She never walked through those woods again. They say, if you wander too close to the trees on a quiet autumn night, you might still hear his whisper, they're waiting for you. Story number 7, The Eyes in the Walls. Lucas had never been one to believe in superstitions. He was a man of logic, always needing a scientific explanation for everything, and the idea of ghosts or spirits was something he dismissed with a chuckle. So when he found an old, inexpensive apartment on the outskirts of town, he was thrilled. It was perfect, close to his new job, spacious enough, and, most importantly, affordable. The first few weeks in the apartment were uneventful. He settled in, unpacked his things, and made the space his own. But there was something strange about the place, something that gnawed at him every time he sat alone in the living room. It was the silence. There were no sounds at all, no creaks, no distant hum of traffic, no murmurs from the neighbors. Just complete, suffocating silence. One night, as he was getting ready for bed, Lucas noticed something odd. As he passed the hallway, he saw a faint glimmer of light coming from the living room. Confused, he walked in, only to find the source of the light, a small crack in the wall behind the bookshelf. Curious, Lucas moved the bookshelf and peered into the crack. What he saw made his blood run cold. Behind the wall, hidden in the darkness, were two small, round holes. They looked like eyes, sockets, empty and staring at him from the other side of the drywall. He recoiled in shock, stepping back. There was no way the holes were natural, they were too precise, too deliberate. He told himself it was just a strange, unexplainable anomaly. Maybe the previous tenants had drilled into the wall for some reason. Still, something about those holes lingered in his mind, like a haunting whisper that wouldn't let him go. The next day, Lucas tried to forget about the holes, but they kept nagging at him. When he passed the bookshelf again, he noticed that the crack had widened slightly, as if the eyes were staring at him even more intensely. He felt an unsettling chill creeping down his spine. That night, as he lay in bed trying to sleep, the silence in the apartment became unbearable. The walls seemed to pulse with a strange energy, like something was moving just behind them. Then, he heard it, a soft, slow scraping sound, like nails gently scratching the inside of the wall. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with every passing second. His heart raced as the sound continued, each scrape closer and more deliberate. He jumped out of bed and grabbed a flashlight, his hands shaking. He rushed to the living room, determined to confront whatever was making the noise. As he approached the crack in the wall, he could hear the scraping more clearly now. It was unmistakable. And then, he saw it. Through the small gap in the drywall, Lucas could make out the faintest glint of something shiny, a dark, unnatural shape moving behind the wall. His pulse quickened. Whatever it was alive. And it was watching him. He tried to ignore the terror rising in his chest, but the scraping grew louder, more frantic, as if something was desperately trying to escape. The air around him grew thick with dread, and the temperature in the room dropped, turning his breath visible in the flashlight's beam. Unable to bear it any longer, Lucas grabbed a crowbar from the toolbox in the corner and started prying at the drywall, the crack widening with each pull. His hands were trembling so badly that he could barely keep a grip, but he had to see what was behind that wall. Finally, with one last tug, the wall gave way. Dust and debris spilled out, and Lucas staggered back, coughing, as the flashlight illuminated the opening. But what he saw made him freeze in terror. Behind the drywall was a small, dark room, and in the center of it stood a figure, humanoid, but wrong in every possible way. It had no face, just a smooth, featureless surface, like the skin of a mannequin. Its body was thin and elongated, its limbs twisted in unnatural ways. And its eyes, the eyes that had been staring at him from the wall, were now open, wide, and black, like deep, endless pits. The thing didn't move, but Lucas could feel its presence. It was as if it had been waiting for him, trapped behind the walls, watching him every moment since he had moved in. In a burst of pure instinct, Lucas ran. He bolted out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. The eerie scraping sound followed him into the hallway, echoing through the empty building as if it was chasing him. He didn't stop running until he reached the street, and he didn't look back. The next morning, Lucas returned with the landlord and a few maintenance workers. The room behind the wall was gone, nothing but solid, unbroken drywall. There was no sign of the strange figure, no evidence of the eyes or the scraping. It was as if everything had been a figment of his imagination. But Lucas knew what he had seen. He knew what he had heard. The apartment was soon re-rented to another tenant, but the strange events continued. Neighbors reported hearing odd noises at night, scratching and scraping sounds coming from behind the walls. And sometimes, when the building was quiet enough, people would swear they could see two dark, hollow eyes peering out from the cracks in the walls, watching them from the darkness. Lucas never spoke of what happened again. He moved far away, leaving the apartment behind, but he could never escape the memory of the eyes. And every time he closed his eyes at night, he could still hear the scraping. It followed him, always. Waiting. Story number 8, The Mirror in the Basement. It was a quiet, unremarkable evening when Claire and her husband Mark decided to clear out the basement of their newly purchased home. The house had been on the market for months, a bit worn down but full of potential. Claire loved the character of the place, the creaky floors, the old wooden beams, the charm that older homes seemed to have. But the basement was different. The moment Claire stepped down into the dimly lit basement, she felt an uneasy chill settle over her. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and the small flickering light bulb overhead barely provided enough light to see. Mark was already deep into sorting through boxes, his back turned to Claire as she wandered further into the room. She was looking for anything of interest, maybe an old antique or a forgotten piece of history, but instead, she stumbled upon something far more unsettling. At the far end of the basement, covered by a dusty, tattered sheet, was an old full-length mirror. The frame was ornate, carved with intricate designs, though weathered by time. The glass was murky, obscured by a thick layer of dust and grime. Claire felt drawn to it, despite the cold knot tightening in her stomach. She could barely see her reflection in the glass, just a shadowy, distorted version of herself. "Mark, look at this," she called out, her voice low but curious. Mark walked over and looked at the mirror, shrugging. "Old mirror, nothing special. Let's just get rid of it. It's not worth keeping." Claire, however, couldn't shake the odd feeling that settled in her chest as she stared at it. She took a deep breath and began wiping the glass with her sleeve, eager to get a clearer view of herself. As the grime began to clear, something caught her eye, a figure behind her. She spun around, but the basement was empty, save for Mark, who was still rummaging through boxes. Her heart skipped a beat, and she turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, though it wasn't her reflection. It was a tall, shadowy figure, its face indistinguishable, but the outline was unmistakably human. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the figure in the glass, her hands trembling. "Mark, I'm serious. We need to get rid of this mirror," she said, her voice suddenly unsteady. Mark raised an eyebrow. "What's wrong?" "It's just a mirror." But Claire couldn't tear her eyes away from it. The figure didn't move, but its presence seemed to loom over her, filling the room with a cold, heavy energy. It was like it was waiting for something. "That's it," Claire whispered, backing away from the mirror. "We're done here." Mark, still oblivious to the growing tension, shrugged and nodded. "All right, let's head upstairs." As they left the basement and closed the door behind them, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, as she lay in bed, she kept seeing the image of the figure in her mind. It felt as though the mirror had somehow marked her, as though something from within that reflection had followed her into the house. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. Claire would catch glimpses of movement in the corner of her eye, shadows that seemed to flicker just out of sight. But it wasn't until the following Sunday that things truly began to escalate. She was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when she heard the softest whisper, so faint she almost thought it was the wind. "Claire!" She froze, the dish she was holding slipping from her fingers and shattering on the floor. The voice had come from upstairs. "Mark," she called out, but there was no answer. She felt a shiver run down her spine. She turned toward the stairs, her gaze falling on the hallway at the top. For a moment, she thought she saw the figure again, the same dark shape, standing motionless, at the edge of the hallway. It wasn't clear, but she knew it was watching her. Her heart raced as she ran upstairs, checking every room, but no one was there. Mark was out in the garage, working on something, and the house was eerily quiet. It felt colder now, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Later that night, unable to sleep, Claire ventured back down to the basement. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, perhaps an explanation, or some way to prove to herself that she wasn't imagining things. As she stood in front of the mirror, she felt the familiar chill in the air. The basement felt different now, darker, as though something was shifting around her. And then, she saw it again. The figure. This time, it moved. It was slow at first, just a subtle shift in the reflection. The figure stepped forward, its outline becoming clearer, its face still hidden in shadow. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as the figure came closer, its form growing more distinct. And then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, the figure spoke. "Let me out." Claire's blood ran cold. She took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to run, but her legs felt frozen in place. The figure in the mirror reached toward her, its hand stretching out of the glass as though it were trying to break through. With a scream, Claire bolted out of the basement, slamming the door behind her. She didn't stop running until she was in the safety of the living room, where she collapsed onto the couch, shaking with fear. The mirror was still down there, she knew that much. And the figure, whatever it was waiting. Mark didn't believe her, of course. He thought it was just a bad dream, a result of stress from the move. But Claire knew the truth. The figure in the mirror wasn't just a reflection, it was something far darker, something that had been trapped inside that old, cursed frame for years. The next day, Claire made Mark help her get rid of the mirror. They threw it out in the yard, and that was the last they ever saw of it. But sometimes, late at night, Claire swears she can hear soft whispers from the basement, calling her name. And every now and then, when she walks past a mirror, she catches a glimpse of something, just for a second, a shadow in the glass, waiting. Story number 9, The Cabin in the Woods. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway, a retreat from the stress of work, a chance to reconnect with nature, and escape the bustle of city life. Rachel and her boyfriend Jake had found a secluded cabin in the woods, far from any neighbors or busy roads. The listing promised peace and tranquility, a rustic experience, and that's exactly what they were looking for. They arrived late in the afternoon, the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon. The cabin was everything they had hoped for, small, cozy, with a large stone fireplace and large windows that framed the surrounding trees. They unpacked quickly, eager to start their weekend adventure. But as the evening wore on, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As night fell, the forest around them grew unnervingly silent. No crickets, no owls, no rustling leaves. Just silence. It was the kind of silence that seemed unnatural, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Rachel mentioned it to Jake, but he laughed it off. "You're just not used to being out in the middle of nowhere," he teased, pulling her into a hug. "Relax, it's just quiet out here. It's peaceful." They spent the evening by the fire, talking and laughing. But as the hours passed, Rachel's unease grew. She couldn't ignore the sensation that they weren't alone in the woods, that something was watching them from the darkened trees outside the cabin. She told Jake again, but he was too caught up in the warmth of the fire to really listen. So she tried to push the feeling aside, trying to enjoy the moment. It wasn't until after midnight that the first strange event occurred. Jake had gone outside to use the bathroom, leaving Rachel alone in the cabin. She sat in front of the fire, the only source of light in the otherwise pitch-black room, when she heard a soft scratching sound on the window. At first, she thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or some other nocturnal creature, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. She stood up and walked toward the window, peering through the heavy curtains. There was nothing. Just the dark expanse of trees and the faint glow of the moon in the sky. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, movement, just beyond the tree line. A figure, standing still, watching her. It was too far to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. A person, standing perfectly still, staring directly at the cabin. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped back from the window. It wasn't a neighbor, there was no one for miles. It had to be someone who shouldn't be out there, someone who didn't belong. She rushed to grab her phone, but as she reached for it, the scratching noise came again, this time louder, more insistent, coming from the front door. Heart pounding, she backed away from the door, eyes darting around the cabin, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. The door rattled as if someone was trying to force it open. The scratching turned to banging. Jake came running inside just as the door handle jiggled violently. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, his eyes wide with confusion and concern. Rachel could barely speak, her voice trembling. "Someone's out there. I saw them, just standing in the woods." Jake went to the door, looking through the peephole, but he saw nothing. The night outside was still, the trees swaying gently in the wind. "It's just your imagination," he said, trying to calm her down. "It's probably an animal or a branch scratching at the door." But Rachel wasn't convinced. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to get in the car and drive back to town. She didn't care how crazy it sounded. But Jake, as calm and level-headed as ever, convinced her to stay. "I'll go check around the cabin," he said. "We're fine. Just stay here, lock the door." Rachel sat on the couch, staring at the door, listening intently to the night. The silence had returned, but it was the kind of silence that pressed in on her, suffocating her with dread. Minutes passed, and Rachel's nerves frayed as she waited. She could hear Jake outside, moving around the cabin, his footsteps crunching in the leaves. But then, a few minutes later, she heard something else. A low, guttural growl. She froze, her blood running cold. It wasn't Jake. It was too deep, too animalistic. The growl was followed by a loud crash. Then the sound of frantic footsteps, running toward the cabin. "Rachel!" Jake screamed from outside. "Get in the back room. Now!" Rachel leaped up, her heart pounding in her chest as she ran to the back of the cabin. She slammed the door shut behind her and crouched in the corner, trying to quiet her breathing. The growl was closer now, almost right outside the cabin. The minutes stretched on forever. Then, she heard it, Jake's voice again, desperate, but faint. "Ratch, please. I'm sorry. I thought I saw. I didn't know." The door to the back room burst open. Jake stood there, eyes wide with terror. His clothes were torn, blood smeared across his face. And in the dark, shadowy corner of the room, something moved. Something wrong. It was too tall, too long, and its eyes glowed a pale, unnatural blue. "Jake!" Rachel screamed, but it was too late. The creature lunged toward him, and just as it reached him, there was a loud snap. The figure was gone, like it had never been there. Rachel ran to the front door, throwing it open and bolting into the woods, terrified that the creature would chase her. She didn't look back until she reached the road, where she flagged down a passing car and begged the driver to take her to safety. The police found Jake the next day. There were no signs of the creature, and the cabin appeared undisturbed. But Rachel swears she knows what happened. She saw it with her own eyes. That cabin, they say, is still standing, abandoned but never truly empty. Some locals claim to have seen strange things in the woods, figures that stand motionless among the trees, waiting for the next victim. Story number 10, The Dollmaker's Curse. Amelia had always been drawn to antiques. Ever since she was a child, she'd loved the idea of objects with a past, something with a history. So, when she found an old shop tucked away on a quiet street in town, she couldn't resist stepping inside. The shop was filled with strange and beautiful things, paintings, furniture, old clocks, and odd trinkets from another time. But what caught her eye was a display case in the back corner. Inside the case were dozens of dolls that were unlike any she had ever seen before. They were exquisite, handcrafted with delicate porcelain faces and intricate clothing, but there was something about them that sent a chill up Amelia's spine. Their eyes were too lifelike, too expressive, as though they were watching her. Some were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, others in more modern outfits, but all of them seemed to have one thing in common, an unsettling, eerie gaze. The old man who ran the shop, Mr. Calloway, noticed her staring at the dolls and shuffled over with a slow, deliberate gait. "Ah, you have a keen eye," he said, his voice raspy but kind. "Those are my creations, dolls like no others." Amelia was intrigued. "You made them?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. He nodded, his pale eyes gleaming with pride. "I've been making them for years. But they're special. Each one holds a piece of something more. His voice trailed off, and for a moment, it sounded as though he was lost in thought, almost like he was remembering something painful. Amelia was captivated but confused. A piece of something more? Mr. Calloway hesitated for a moment before speaking again, his voice dropping to a whisper. They hold a bit of the soul of their maker. Some say it's a curse, others a gift. I only know one thing. Once you have one, you cannot escape it. They become a part of you. Despite the oddness of his words, Amelia didn't feel afraid. Instead, she was drawn to a particular doll in the corner of the case. It was a small girl, no older than 5, with flowing golden hair and a blue dress that shimmered faintly in the light. The doll's eyes were wide and full of emotion, and for reasons Amelia couldn't explain, she felt an almost overwhelming desire to own it. "I'll take this one," she said, pointing to the doll. Mr. Calloway's expression changed. His eyes darkened for just a second, but then he gave a small nod. "Of course, my dear. But remember, these dolls are not toys. They are more than that. They have a way of following you, of becoming a part of your life. Once you bring one into your home, it will never leave." Amelia laughed off his words, convinced it was just an old man's superstition. She paid for the doll, thanked him, and left the shop, the bell above the door jingling as she stepped into the street. For the first few days, everything was normal. The doll sat on a shelf in her living room, a silent observer to her daily life. But then, strange things began to happen. At night, Amelia would hear faint footsteps in the hall, too soft to be footsteps at all, as though someone was walking in the room beside her. Sometimes, the doll's eyes would seem to follow her across the room, even when she swore she hadn't moved it. She told herself it was her imagination. After all, the doll was just that, a doll. But the more she tried to dismiss it, the more the strange occurrences continued. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Amelia returned home to find the doll on the floor. She was certain she had left it on the shelf, but now it lay face down in the middle of the room. As she picked it up, she noticed something even more unsettling. The doll's clothes were damp, as though it had been outside in the rain. But there had been no rain that day. That night, as she lay in bed, she felt the unmistakable sensation of someone watching her. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with a presence that wasn't there before. Amelia turned to her side, staring at the doll sitting on the shelf. Its eyes were wide open, its gaze fixed directly on her. But it wasn't just the doll that unnerved her, it was the expression on its face. The look was no longer serene, it was something darker, more sinister, as if the doll were aware of something that Amelia wasn't. Suddenly, she heard the sound of a child's laughter, soft, almost melodic. She bolted upright, heart pounding in her chest, and looked around the room. The laughter seemed to come from nowhere, echoing through the walls. Amelia's eyes darted back to the doll, and that's when she saw it. The doll was smiling. It was a small, subtle change, but the corners of its mouth were curved upward, just slightly, enough to give it an unsettling grin. Amelia's blood ran cold. She knew, without a doubt, that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, the doll was gone. It wasn't on the shelf, nor on the floor, nor anywhere in the room. She searched the apartment, growing more frantic with each passing minute. She found it, finally, in the corner of the living room, sitting on the windowsill. Its eyes were still staring, but now its face was expressionless, almost too calm, as though it had been waiting for her to find it. That's when the nightmares started. Every night, Amelia dreamed of the doll. It would appear at the foot of her bed, standing motionless, its eyes watching her. But the dreams weren't just visions, they felt real. She could hear the faint sound of footsteps following her around the apartment, always just behind her. And when she turned to look, the doll was always there, standing in the corner, waiting. Desperate, Amelia went back to the antique shop, hoping Mr. Calloway could help. But when she arrived, the shop was closed, and the windows were boarded up. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Panicked, she asked around the neighborhood, but no one had seen Mr. Calloway in weeks. The shop had disappeared, as if it had never been there at all. Terrified and feeling trapped, Amelia decided to leave the apartment. She packed her things and moved into a new place, far from the shop, far from the doll. But even there, she could feel it, always lurking, always watching. The doll had followed her. And sometimes, when the night is still, Amelia swears she can hear faint laughter echoing through her apartment. The doll's smile, ever present in her mind, never fades. She knows now that Mr. Calloway wasn't just making dolls, he was trapping souls, and hers was the next one he'd claimed. The doll would never leave her. It had become a part of her, just as he said it would. And now, every night, the laughter grows louder, waiting for her to succumb to its pull. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.